Hey there, it's Melissa Brunetti, and welcome to the Mind Your Own Karma podcast.
Hey there, Karma crew. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Mind Your Own Karma, the Adoption Chronicles. Today, I have Rebecca Berg on the show. She is a Los Angeles-based registered dietitian nutritionist and adoptee who specializes in eating disorders, mental health, and body image. She is passionate about helping adoptees learn how to connect to and care for their bodies. Alongside you, she gently explores food and body coping mechanisms with curiosity and compassion to cultivate understanding of how they've been protecting you and keeping you safe. Rebecca uses a collaborative, weight-inclusive, trauma-informed approach infused with humor and authenticity. Rebecca is also a domestic, same-race infant adoptee, fully recovered from her own eating struggles. She hopes to bring more awareness to the rarely discussed and yet potent intersection between adoptees and eating disorders. She loves speckled ceramics, sunshine naps, Sam Smith neighborhood cats, and deep conversations. Here is my interview with Rebecca Berg. So we are welcoming Rebecca to the show today. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello.
So I don't know why I wasn't even thinking about coping with food when it came to adoptees. I don't know why I wasn't thinking that. And the human body and how we deal with trauma is so amazing, how it does keep us safe. I didn't even think about using food to do that. So I'm so glad that you're coming on the show because I know there's probably a bunch of people that are struggling with this and I haven't talked about it yet. So thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I think I share your thoughts in that until I started making those connections myself, I had never connected the dots that anything related to food could have to do with my own adoption story or the way that I processed that. And now that I'm in a lot of different adoptee I guess like support groups on Facebook, I see that topic around eating and eating disorders come up pretty frequently. And I'm just like, yes, we need to do something about this.
Huge topic, I'm sure. So let's get a little background about you first, and let's find out what you know about your adoption story. Why were you put up for adoption?
Yeah. I was adopted as an infant, and I've always known that I was adopted. My uh my biological mom was just not in a place to parent at that time, had just gone through a traumatic experience of her own, was dealing with a lot of grief and probably PTSD and stress and just a lot of instability. And so it was not a difficult decision for her to place me for adoption. My parents are actually, my mom is an adoption social worker, or I guess she's retired now, but she had been my whole life. And then my dad is a divorce lawyer. So, growing up, even though I always knew I was adopted, it wasn't something that was really, it was acknowledged, but like, because it was just so common for me to have dinner time conversation with my two parents talking about like court dates and judges and which judge they were going before. And, there was vocabulary that I knew that I just didn't think was odd. Like we would talk about TPR hearings, termination of parental rights, and my mom would do a lot of home visits, and sometimes she would even fly to different states to help bring children together with families. And so, yeah, I think the normalization of adoption and foster care and TPR stuff in my life made it so that it wasn't taboo, but it also wasn't something that I personalized.
Right.
Yeah.
So they probably didn't have much problem getting a child for adoption if they were kind of in that realm there. Did you have any other siblings or?
Nope, it's just me.
Just you.
Yeah.
So growing up, how was it in that family growing up it sounds like you were kind of treated as an adult from as a little kid. The dinner
Yes.
table talk, but how was it growing up in the family?
Yeah, I mean, the it's a hard question to answer because I feel like I had everything that I needed financially and socially. I never felt um like we weren't struggling, to put food on the table or anything like that, but there definitely was a disconnect between me and my parents and my emotional experience. I'm very, very sensitive, like a deep feeler, and just had a lot of big feelings when I was little. And I think that that was challenging for both of my parents because, um, my mom being a social worker, I love her very much, but there was like an intellectualization of it, like,
Hmm.
oh, you're 12 and th this is why you're acting this way because at 12 years old, developmentally, you're going to be pushing back like it's like that was annoying.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
and it just took me, it takes me a long time to open up to people and be vulnerable. So, every once in a while, my mom would come into my room. Like, I think the way I remember it is like every 6 months, she'd be like, so you're thinking about your birth, mom? Like, do you have any questions? And I'd be like,
Wow.
no, go away. Um, so yeah, I think there's that piece. And then also my mom converted to Judaism to be with my dad. And my dad is Jewish and I was raised Jewish, but I don't look Jewish.
Hmm.
And so I put that in quotation marks. So I dove very deeply into my Jewish identity, but I always felt this underlying sense of uneasiness. Like there's a lot of discussion in Judaism around our ancestors, especially around the Holocaust and,
Hmm.
persecution. And then there's that genetic piece, swipe your cheek for a bone marrow donation and test for these diseases. And it just like those little reminders of like, I'm not actually
Yeah.
Jewish, like
Yeah.
even though I'm right here. So I felt often like an internal chaos around like, I don't really feel like I belong here, but I wasn't at that time connecting it always to being adopted. I was just like, it's confusing. I have a blended family and like, it's just hard to know my place growing up in a town where most people were not Jewish. I was kind of like, I remember in elementary school, my mom would send me to elementary school with like the Hanukkah story, and I would read the Hanukkah story to all my classmates, right? So it's like, yes, I had that sense of pride, but it was also drawing more attention to me, like she's different.
Yeah. Almost, I would have felt almost like an imposter syndrome type of thing or something,
Hmm.
like you're portraying yourself to be this, in front of your class, but really it's so conflicting. It really is. So growing up, when did you realize, or did you realize that you were using food to cope?
I don't really think that started until I was in my 20s. Um, I would say in middle school, my parents started dieting and going on Weight Watchers, and I became more aware of food during that time and just some of the food items in our house shifted. But it wasn't until I moved to New York City and I was in a new environment trying to make friends that I started to get immersed in like gym culture. And I used exercise and food as a way to cultivate belonging and to feel a sense of identity. I never, when you're interviewing for jobs, everyone says, like, tell me about yourself. And that was always the most paralyzing question for me. Could
Yeah.
never answer it. I hated it. I would script out all these things of what to say. But when I got into the world of nutrition, suddenly it was very easy. I I'm into nutrition. I'm a health nut. I'm a runner. Let me tell you about the races I've done. Let me tell you about the things I'm cooking. It was just very easy for me to take on that
Mm.
identity and then for people to understand it, right? Oh, so you're studying to be a dietitian? Tell me what's good and what's bad and how are your training plan? And that's very easy for people to for that to become a topic of conversation. But I think for me, it was a really great way for me to distract myself from the the internal uneasiness that I felt from not having a sense of self or identity. And yeah, just literally running from myself.
Yeah. So how has being an adoptee shaped your identity and your outlook in life, you think?
Well, I think, on your show, you have people in so many different stages of their journey. And I consider myself to be in the very, very early stages because I came out of the fog only 3 or so years ago. So prior to that time, I really didn't think that being adopted had any effect on me at all.
Mm.
And when I first started working with a therapist more frequently, it was 2020, and I was sort of like a deer in the headlights in that first session. And she said, "Tell me about yourself." And for some reason, I started with the adoption thing. I was like, "I'm adopted," and blah blah blah. And she said, "Well, oh, how has that affected you?" And I said, "Oh no, that has nothing. That doesn't affect anything." It wasn't until like many months later that I sort of, after a lot of discussion about like I don't belong, why don't I feel like anything? Why do I feel like an alien? I finally connected the dots. But I would say now in this stage of my life, it affects the way I look at everything. Like it comes up most days of my life, thinking about the grief feels very heavy right now, and the exploration and the loss and trying to understand everything that I've been through and that I will go through. So I think it does make it harder for me to move through the world because feel I feel like there's still a lot for me to process with with that piece of me. And I'm I guess you could I reconnected with my birth mom shortly after I came out of the fog. And then I found my biological father as well, discovered I had several half siblings. And so it's just a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot to hold.
Right. Was there something that happened that made you come out of the fog or made you realize?
Yeah. I was scrolling on Instagram, and a therapist that I follow was talking about infertility, and she said something about adoption. And I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting. I've never looked up anything about adoption ever on social media. And so I think I clicked on a hashtag or something like adoption or adoption story. And I think this context is important. At the time, I was working as an eating disorder dietitian. I was also consulting at a trauma treatment center. So all of my clients were struggling with PTSD and eating disorders or disordered eating. And I had just realized that I had PTSD that I thought was connected to this one specific thing that happened to me in college. So I'm on Instagram looking at the adoption hashtag, and Anne Heffron's post comes up and it says, "Adoption is trauma." And I had like a full body cellular reaction. Like my whole body was tingling. I felt like I was going to pass out. I remember I was right here in my dining room, and I like slid down the wall. I was like, holy shit.
Wow.
So I texted my therapist and I was like, the craziest thing just happened. Like I had this full body reaction. And she said, "Well, what was the post about?" And I said it was about adoption. And she's like, "Okay, we'll get to that when I see you in person." Um, but that was honestly it. It catapulted me out of the fog. Like
Wow.
in that moment, I remember thinking, "Oh my God, my whole life makes sense.
Mm.
Everything that I struggled with makes sense. I felt like I was grasping at straws to find the through line. Why did I struggle with my eating behaviors? Why did I struggle with binge drinking? Why do I have such bad anxiety? Why do I feel like I don't belong in my family? Why do I have such a hard time with intimacy? And then it was like, oh,
Wow.
light bulb.
Yeah. Was your therapist adoptee informed? Did you feel like,
Yeah, I'm still working with her. She is not adopted herself, but she has helped me tremendously, and I'm so grateful.
wow, that's great. So you said you did find your biological family. Talk about that a little bit. So you said you found them right after you came out of the fog?
Yeah. So the longer story is when I was 27, I was about to graduate from graduate school and move from New York City to Los Angeles. And I just felt like I should find my bio mom. I don't really know why at that time that I felt that, but my mom, my adoptive mom, who I call my mom, had given me some papers related to my story that she had been trying to give me since I was 18. And she was like, "Do you want these papers that I have for you?" And I was like, "No, I don't want them." And she would ask me like every year, and I'm like, "Nope, still don't want them." And then one
Mm,
year she was like, "You have to have these," like force them on me. So when I read my story, I was like, "Oh wow, like that's really intense." I was really disconnected from it, and I would tell people like, "Look at this story. It's so dramatic. It's like a movie." Right? But that's just because I was not connected to it. Like I
hmm.
felt like I was reading about someone else, even though
Yeah.
I was reading about myself. So I used a confidential intermediary to contact her, and we exchanged a few letters when I was 27. But I felt really numb. And I remember walking down the street with my friend, and she was like, "Well, you found your mom. Like, how are you feeling?" And I so vividly remember looking around in the park and saying, "I feel nothing. I don't
Mm,
feel anything. I feel like I should be feeling something, but I don't."
yeah.
So, unfortunately, which I didn't realize at the time, I essentially ghosted her. I sent a letter, she sent a letter, I sent a letter, she sent a letter, and then I just never wrote back. And that was for about like 3 or 4 years until I was in therapy and, saw that Instagram post. In the last letter that she had written me, she had put her email address and her home address. So I sent her an email and I said, like, I've been thinking about you and I have all these questions. And, we just started talking via email. Um, and it sort of unfolded from there.
And so how did the reunion go?
I think the reunion, I think reunion should be named something else because
Right.
it's really hard to reunite with a stranger, even if that person carried you and gave birth to you. It's
Yeah.
really, really, it's really complicated. I think in
Yeah.
the beginning, I went through, um, like most adoptees, a period of what I would, what I feel like now is obsession and infatuation. I wanted to write to her all the time. We exchanged a lot of messages and text messages. A year later, we met in person. And now I would say that things have slowed down a lot. And we're both very, we're both very guarded and quiet people. And I think she has been through a lot in her life. And there's just this difficulty with reaching her heart.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I know that she listens to some of my podcasts, so I want to keep it, you know,
Yeah.
respectful. The other and not like give like too much detail.
Sure.
The other side of my family, my bio dad, I actually also used a confidential intermediary to try to find him. And she told me he was dead. So I spent legitimately 3 days mourning,
Oh my God.
mourning someone, mourning someone who was not my father,
Oh,
because
wow.
um, once she told me that he was dead, I was very taken aback and I was devastated and I had like just I was wailing. I've never felt like that kind of grief before. And eventually, um, my bio mom checked in on me and she was like, haven't heard from you. How have you been doing? And I said, I haven't been doing very well. I found out that, bio dad had passed away and sent her like the obituary or something. And she wrote back, that's not him. And that's like,
Shoot.
are you kidding me? So that was emotionally very, very
Yeah.
traumatic for me. And essentially what happened, it was that my bio dad has a very, very common name. So what did I do at that point? I had done Ancestry, didn't help. I did 23andMe and I got matched with an uncle.
Uh-huh.
And so I messaged him on 23andMe, no response. I waited, I waited, I waited. And I did like some crazy sleuthing work to try to find more details. And my mom actually helped me. She said, oh, I have these, lawyer documents in the safe deposit box from when you were born. You think maybe that has some details on it? I was like, yes, mom. I think probably that would have some details on it. So, I mean, the information, I actually still haven't seen those papers, but the information, according to her, was redacted. But it was
Oh,
old. So she was like holding it up to the light with a flashlight to try to see some numbers. And I don't remember if we discovered an address or something, but we discovered some information. And then I went on in like full detective mode on Facebook with every single man that had my father's name.
wow.
And eventually I found this one guy and I was like, I kind of think I look like him. And it was him.
Oh,
I
wow.
I texted a picture to my bio mom. She was like, "Yep, that's him. Like he's wearing a hat where he worked." What? Like why would you have a Facebook profile where you are wearing a hat of a younger version of yourself where you worked when you were like 22?
Yeah.
Very, very strange. So that was one piece of the puzzle. But then my uncle on 23andMe, he never responded. So once again, I'm back on Facebook and I looked at like every single person who was connected with that man who I thought looked like me. And I just sent I sent a message saying, hey, I was adopted. My name's Rebecca. I'm trying to get in touch with my bio dad. Can you please, let him know that I'm looking for him? And I gave my phone number. The next day, I was in a client session. Um, and for some reason, I didn't have my phone on silent. So I'm sitting in the client session and my phone starts ringing and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I look over and I see that it says area code Pittsburgh. And I'm like, holy shit.
Yeah.
That is definitely my bio dad calling me right now. So I'm like, oh, excuse me, let me turn off the phone. I'm like, okay, focus, focus. We have
Oh
to
my
focus on the
gosh.
client. But yeah, after the client left, I listened to my voicemail and it was him,
Wow.
which was nuts. And I don't want to ramble too much about that, but the other thing, I guess you were asked about reunion. So when I called him, um, he said, wow, I haven't thought about you in 30 years.
How did that
So,
feel?
he started with that. So it was kind of, I think I was just in shock. And then he uh, shared a lot about himself and his family. And it was clear that there was just an overall lack of sensitivity to
Mm,
where I was coming from and my situation and how I might feel. he started texting me pictures of like, these are my two boys. I love them with my whole heart. Like,
Yeah.
these are the loves of my life. And I'm like,
Right.
are you not putting this together? How that could possibly be hurtful for me?
Could be a little
So
insensitive. Yes.
yeah.
Wow.
He also made me laugh because he's like, oh yeah, I have a dog. I adopted her. Her name is Trauma. Like, what?
Oh my gosh.
So
Yeah.
I often think about that. One interesting piece of adoption for a lot of people is I was, both of my biological parents are from the East Coast, and they were raised Catholic, and I was adopted into a family raised Jewish, had a lot more opportunities, um, a lot more financial privilege. And so that creates a divide
Hmm.
that is, it's hard to, there wasn't a lot that we had in common. And so
Yeah.
there wasn't a lot for us to chat about.
Right.
Um, so that makes it hard with both him and my half brothers. So
Yeah.
I don't really talk to them because as much as I want, you know, I want people in my life who want to have a relationship with me, and it feels like they kind of don't.
Yeah. Yeah. That is so complicated. All those little things that people just don't think about when they talk to adoptees, you know? Are you an adoptee struggling with feelings of trauma and disconnection? Somatic hypnotherapy using SMGI can help. Somatic mindful guided imagery can heal past wounds, find inner peace, and reconnect you with your true self. Visit somatichealingjourneys.com today and start your journey to healing. Well, let's talk about your profession a little bit. What inspired you to be a dietitian? And was there like a specific moment or experience that guided you in that direction?
Yeah. Um, Honestly, it was my own unhealthy obsession with nutrition. So prior to becoming a dietitian, I was working in nonprofit event planning. And as I was getting into that gym and health, nutrition, fitness culture, I became more and more engrossed in it. And I lost weight. And then I found myself thinking about nutrition all the time, looking at things on while I was supposed to be working. I would always bring, healthy foods into the office. And I became so unfulfilled in my day job that I thought I have to switch careers. So I looked
Mm.
into being a chef. I looked into being a food journalist, moving to a farm, and I learned about being a dietitian. Eventually decided the dietitian route because I thought it would give me the most financial stability and like long-term career, safety. Um, and then, when I first started having to go to like night school and community college on the weekends because my bachelor's degree is in religious studies and Spanish. So I had no science background. So I had to work and then do that on the side. Eventually I quit my job and went to grad school. My grad school application essay was basically like, I figured it out. I figured out how to be healthy. You just got to eat more fruits and vegetables and work out. And, I lost weight and I feel great. And now I'm doing all this volunteer work and I want to help other people do the same. People just need more information. That was, a younger version of me who didn't have all the information at the time. Um, so in grad school, I learned that it was much more complicated. So by the end of graduate school, I realized, I still want to be a dietitian, but I just think that it's not as black and white as I thought it was. So when I moved out to Los Angeles, I was doing my internship at the Veterans Affairs Hospital here. And interestingly, they were very focused on having us focus on the nutrition related diagnoses and not so much the mental health piece.
Mm.
So even though, different veterans, they would list out their diagnoses like PTSD or bipolar disorder or, substance use disorder. And they would say like, don't really worry about those. We're going to focus on the heart disease.
Wow.
At the time, was a very type A rule follower type student. So I'm like, I will do exactly what I'm told. But in practice, it didn't make sense because if someone is struggling with PTSD and homelessness and substance abuse, it was like what I felt like what I was saying was dumb and irrelevant. So eventually I became much more interested in the mental health piece and the understanding the systemic factors that lead somebody to struggle with their eating or struggle with their health. And that's what pushed me into the field of eating disorders and trauma. Um, so ironically, I feel like I started off my journey in a place of having an unhealthy obsession with food, but not realizing it. And then I ended up in the eating disorder field. I feel that me ending up in the eating disorder field was sort of like the universe pushing me to help uncover myself. Because without that, I wouldn't have worked at the trauma treatment center. I wouldn't have awoken to my own PTSD. I wouldn't have gone to therapy. So all of that, yeah, it's an important part of my story.
So how do you think your experience as an adoptee influenced your approach to nutrition and how you help others?
It really helps me to have more compassion for everybody. Yeah, I mean, yes, some of my clients are adoptees, but I think we use this phrase in the field called eating disorders are disorders of disconnection, which I always resonated with because I felt like my own eating behaviors were a way for me to disconnect. But when I started thinking about the adoptee experience with that, it just became so obvious. Like we're disconnected from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So these things that what we eat or how we move or don't move are a reflection of that, of how connected or not we are to ourselves and how we respond to our nervous system states. And I think it allows me to be more inquisitive about the whole picture. One client, for instance, had a lot of difficulty with stopping eating, and I was able to zoom out and say, well, what has your relationship been like with endings in your life?
Mm.
And I think she reflected on it like, well, endings, we weren't really given a lot, they weren't really given a lot of attention. So in that way, we had to slow down and acknowledge, like, yes, when you decide to stop eating something that's really pleasurable and you're having a pleasant experience in your body, stopping is there's grief there. There's loss. And you have to move through that. If you if you avoid it and run away from it, it's still going to be there. So I like to say that, my job is really food and feelings because I'm always making those connections. And I think being adopted, being in my own process of grieving and learning and healing helps me better connect with people in that way.
It almost sounds like you need a psychology degree along with.
I've thought of it, but I think I'm done with school for a while.
So, can you discuss any unique challenges that adoptees might face when it comes to nutrition and health?
Yes. Gosh, there are many. I think the main thing that I hear from the people that I see are I don't know how to take care of myself. A lot of the adoptees that I have worked with are really good at taking care of other people. They're givers, helpers, healers, as many of us are. And they don't necessarily know how to apply that same compassion towards themselves. The other thing that I see is just a really deep disconnection from their body and their own a lot of times I would say like it's interoceptive cues, like their own awareness of what's going on inside, but also the murkiness that comes from knowing what is mine and what is theirs. And when I say theirs, I mean like the culture of your adoptive family.
Right.
So a lot of adoptees, you know, along with everyone, although I would say it's more pronounced when you're adopted, like you take on everything in your adoptive family. And then you have to kind of tease out, well, are those my values or are those their values? But sometimes it's really scary to take to think about, okay, maybe those values aren't mine, but then you don't know what your values are.
Right.
And it's disorienting to feel like maybe that safety blanket, even though it's not serving you, it's familiar. So when you take off the blanket, you don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just overwhelming. I think a lot of adoptees find safety in, this isn't a universal declaration, but find safety in being able to control the food that they eat
Hmm.
or don't eat. Because so much of our lives have been not in our control.
Right. Yeah. So are there any particular dietary needs or health concerns that adoptees should be aware of because they don't know their biology and hereditary, do you approach that differently with someone that doesn't know their biology or?
Yes, I do. I think the way that I approach it is firstly acknowledging how that does make it different and more difficult. For instance, with a person who's not adopted, um, I'm thinking about like teens or maybe emerging adults. We might talk about what they're struggling with. And then normally I ask, is there any other family health history or any other family mental health diagnoses that I should know about? And if other family members have struggled with eating disorders or depression or anxiety, then it makes more sense that they're struggling. Or um, I often ask about body lineage too. So if if I can look at the bodies of my ancestors, then I can see like, oh, maybe my thighs do make more sense in this context,
Mhm.
like looking at pictures of people who are related to me. So with adoptees, I acknowledge we don't have any context. And it's really, really difficult living in a contextless body in a world where we're meant to have those mirrors.
Right.
Um, I think that, in terms of like medical tests and things like that, it's helpful to just be very inquisitive and leave no stone unturned if there's something going on that we don't really know why it's happening. Um, but nutrition wise and diet wise, it's so individual. I just
Yeah.
take it person by person.
How important do you think it is for any practitioner, traditional medicine, anyone to have on their intake form the question, are you adopted? How important do you think that is?
Mm, yeah. Um, I think it's so important. I mean, I feel like going to the doctor is always a little bit activating for me because it's having to confront that question,
Mhm.
you know, every single time. For some reason, I'm like, can you look at all these other things? I think it would help me and perhaps other adoptees just feel seen to know that, we are valid, like we are valid. I was going to say this is normal, but it's not normal, but it exists. So, we should put that on the form. Just like not every form should say mother and father, we can change that to caregiver. We can change that to a million things. I think we should have um, that acknowledgement on the yeah, on every intake form. And honestly, I think every intake form could be a lot more trauma informed.
Yes. I thought it was funny. I was at the hospital getting something done, and one of the questions wanted me to list my biological, like they wanted to know like the biological daughter. And there was like, and I mean, my daughter is biological, but I was thinking if that was my adoptive mom filling that out, I know she would put me down, but really I'm not her biological daughter. And I thought, why are they asking it like that? And they didn't even ask about, maybe any adopted kids or anything like that, but they literally put that. And I don't know, maybe, health wise, maybe for blood transfusions or something that might come up. Maybe that's why they asked that, but it just kind of took me back. I was like, wow, they literally put biological, daughter on or son on
Yeah.
there. It's crazy. So what does like a first, like an intake look with you, if someone's coming to you for the first time?
Hmm. I love that question. I don't think anyone's asked that. So my initial assessment is an hour and a half. So I like to preface it with we've got lots of time, don't need to rush through anything. If you need to stretch, let's stretch. If you need to have a snack, let's have a snack. If something feels overwhelming, we don't have to talk about that. We're just meeting for the first time. I go over I'm gonna say I go over everything. I like to dive deep into food and nutrition growing up. So, what was food like in your family? What kind of things did you eat? Did you not eat? What kind of things were encouraged by your caregivers or not? And then how that flows into what's going on, in the present day that's bothering you, what's worrying you, what are you struggling with? Same thing. What kind of foods do you like? What do you not like? I like to ask about how people are hydrating, how people are sleeping, how people are digesting. Definitely ask for prior medical history or other kinds of things that are impacting them. And talk about behaviors. Like, are there any things that you do with food that you wish you didn't do or you feel embarrassed about? Sometimes people are they might be counting calories or they might be chewing and spitting or they might be binging or purging or using laxatives. So I like to ask all of those questions. And even if someone doesn't, bring it up, I'll say like, oh, have you ever used any laxatives? Have you ever made yourself throw up? Kind of gauging where they're
Hmm.
at just to see, because some of those things people don't realize are abnormal or they're just like,
Right.
no, I've always done that. That's what makes me feel better. Um, and I talk about body image, how they feel about their body. Are there any ways in which they are like hyper fixated on their body or that they avoid their body? Um, and I really just take the cue from the client. So if we're talking about something, and I feel like it's a rich area to explore, I'll just keep going on that thread and see what comes up. And of course, asking about like what medications they're on and are you seeing a therapist and do you have a psychiatrist and do you have a primary care doctor and have you had any recent labs? So all of those things are on my intake form. We might not get to every single thing, but I try to get as much information as possible so I know where to go from there because I think it's helpful at the end of a session to say like, okay, so it seems like this is what's going on. And because that's what you're wanting help with, I think we should meet every week, or I think we should meet, every 2 weeks or something like that. And this is what I think we could do long term. Just kind of giving them a roadmap of where we're going to go so it doesn't feel so overwhelming.
Yeah. So it sounds very personalized, which I think is so lacking in traditional medicine nowadays, where, they just try to put you in a box or give you a pill or whatever. But that personalization is so key in helping people get to their goals quicker. So
Yes.
that's awesome.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that because like that is the most important thing of the intake is what are the person's goals, right? What are their goals? Where do they want to go? What are their values? Making sure that I'm looking at everything through that lens because like you said, a lot of times with traditional medicine, doctors, you have a diagnosis and this is where we want to get you. And
Hmm.
that's a power dynamic that I don't want to replicate. Um, and often you will see that replicated in I would say like traditional dietetics where a dietitian visits you in the hospital. But this is very different than that.
Yeah. Do you ever see people that kind of have a unrealistic or maybe an unhealthy goal?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big part of the work, especially before I was in private practice, I was working at a group practice, and I would say more people came to me with very um, rigid desires for a certain weight loss goal. And a lot of people, I would say women in particular, people who identify as women, would come to me and say, I really want to get back to this weight. And I would say, oh, well, when was the last time that you were that weight? And it would be either never or in high school.
Yeah. When I was
So
12.
right? So there's like a cultural piece here where for some reason, we're not for some reason. I know many of the reasons, but we have an expectation that it's normal to want to get back to your high school body when you're 35 or
You've had
45,
4 kids.
right? So it's a gentle dance of like, if someone came to me and said that for first session, I wouldn't say, well, that's unrealistic. I would ask a lot of questions, and maybe as our relationship deepened, I would reflect like, wow, it's really interesting that you want to get back to almost like a prepubescent body that hasn't had any children and has, all that kind of thing, and see what clicks or doesn't click.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of coming out of the fog for some people.
Yeah, a lot of parallels there.
So, in closing, what would you like struggling adoptees to know?
Hmm. I I would like adoptees to know that it's not their fault, that if they're struggling with taking care of their body or understanding how to eat or how to move, that there are so many factors that have made it that way, and that the things that we do with food and with exercise help us survive and help us cope with difficult situations, sensations, and feelings. And it's wise. It's a wise survival skill, and it's brave to realize that maybe you need help and you need support. And luckily, there are so many adoptees in our world who are here to help, support, and heal, and get you where you want to go.
Yeah, that's awesome. So tell us how we can find you, any websites or links.
Yeah. So my practice name is called No Strings Nutrition, and you can find me at nostringsnutrition.com. If you're curious about working with me, the first thing I do is a free discovery call. We chat for like 15 to 20 minutes about what you're looking for, and I can share more about my philosophy, and you can book that right on my website. And you can also find me on Instagram at no.strings.nutrition.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on today, Rebecca, and sharing your story along with what you do. So important. Like I said, it just wasn't anything that I was really thinking about on my radar as being an adoptee issue. And so I know that there's a lot of people out there that are connecting with you and how you can help them today. So thanks for coming on. If you or someone you know is struggling with an eating or nutrition problem, get in touch with Rebecca. She doesn't only work with adoptees, and she could possibly help. She is so compassionate and passionate about what she does. So get in touch with her. All her links are in the show notes. I have some great news. I had the honor of being voted Best Hypnotherapy in Turlock, California, from the Quality Business Awards for 2024. So lots of great things happening. If you are curious about somatic therapy or somatic mindful guided imagery, please get in touch with me. You can go to my website at somatichealingjourneys.com, where you can book a consultation if you have some questions about what SMGI is and how it can help you specifically. These consultations are free. As always, take what you need and leave what you don't. And always remember to mind your own karma. I'll see you next time.
This podcast is created for educational purposes by the telling of adoption experiences. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or Mind Your Own Karma.